I'm Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Member of Parliament for Torfaen and the Chair of the Aneurin Bevan Society. Welcome to the latest of my interviews with former leaders of the Labour Party on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the creation of the National Health Service. Today it's my real pleasure to welcome Dame Margaret Beckett, Member of Parliament for Derby South, who was the acting leader of the Labour Party in 1994.
Margaret, great to see you and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start, if I may, with that creation of the National Health Service in 1948 and the impact that it had on families and their ability to access healthcare. Do you think that its impact is one that really has been felt on the front line over these last 70 years?
I don't really remember it, but my mother told me that at that time we were an ordinary family. My father was on quite a decent wage. We weren't poor, and we just had ordinary childhood ailments, nothing special. But she said, you know, you had the doctor's bill and you paid it off bit by bit, and we still had an outstanding doctor's bill for an ordinary family in ordinary circumstances when the health service came in.
There was also, I think, a particular impact that it had for women because the pre-1948 system was principally based around insured wage earners who tended to be men. It used to be £10, for example, to deliver a baby prior to the National Health Service being introduced. So do you think there is a real impact on gender equality as well from the National Health Service?
Yes, I think that must be true, not just because of the impact it had on people's health, but because of the opportunities it created for women. You know, not just caring employment, but high-quality professional employment. So I don't think there's any doubt it transformed people's lives in a variety of ways that we don't necessarily think of.
And it's been a great political issue throughout the post-war period since it was introduced. Now, Margaret, you came into Parliament in 1974 as the Member of Parliament for Lincoln. How do you reflect on the debate about healthcare in the 1970s to the debate that we now find in 2018?
I think the principal thing is that both in the 70s and today, there's always been this tension whereby basically Conservatives want to lower taxes and cutting public services is the way to do that. And we take the view that, I don't like the word tax burden, but that the tax take is related to the public service needs that we have as a nation and as a population. And so there's always been, I think, that difference and that tension. And whenever they have the opportunity, I'm afraid, it always seems to work out in the end that the Conservatives are not providing the healthcare people need. And if you think back to when we were elected in 1997, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think I'm right in saying that something like 50% of the hospitals that there were then were left over from pre-NHS days. So that shows you the impact of the Tory governments we had through so much of that period.
And in that 18 years of Tory rule between 1979 and 1997, you were of course a Shadow Minister for much of that time. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher introduced a number of reforms in the National Health Service, including the internal market in the late 1980s. How do you reflect on those changes that were made then as you look back now?
What I remember principally are two things. First, that it introduced the principle of competition. And I remember people across the health service complaining bitterly that, you know, if you had a problem in hospital A, you might turn to colleagues in hospital B, but you weren't supposed to do that anymore because you were supposed to be competing with each other instead of cooperating to provide the best healthcare you could for your patients. And the second thing was the introduction of fund holding into general practice, where, and there was a lot of money going with it. And the costs per practice were something like £80,000. And it seemed to me then that what the government was trying to do, the then Tory government, was to persuade doctors by stuffing their mouths with gold to take all the responsibilities, and then of course you could start taking the money away. And I remember proposing a model like the one that they had in Nottingham, where something like 200 doctors are banded together to provide services, and their administrative costs were something like 20,000 among all of them, instead of 80,000 a practice. And you know, it just showed it was crazy.
One of the consequences of those 1980s reforms by the Conservatives was to drive up waiting lists, and that became a very particular issue as the 1990s were to go on. Of course, Margaret, you became the Shadow Health Secretary in 1994, I think. Was that a particular issue, and how Labour needed to tackle it when you came into that job?
Waiting lists were important, yes, but to be honest, it was the quality and the amount of healthcare that was available, and I think we were already beginning to see a little bit of the impact of social care, and certainly what was very much a concern for me was that yes, there were all these problems of people, you know. People started to call after the health secretary of the day, bottomley wards, which was people waiting on trolleys in A&E and so on, just like we're seeing again today.
And that was the period where Virginia Bottomley was, I think, the secretary.
That was in that period, and that was happening then at the beginning of the 90s, and we've gone back to the same position now, having had that transformation of waiting lists and waiting times and everything else in between. But I think it was a combination of that failure of delivering healthcare, and also how much people had lost sight of the public health issues, of the things which try to prevent people from becoming ill in the first place, not just treating illness.
And that's really interesting, actually, and those were the challenges, of course, that Labour
Indeed.
faced in 1997 when Tony Blair won that election. You, of course, were President of the Board of Trade at the start of that government, held positions then throughout the Blair government and indeed later in the Brown years too. There was a vast increase in NHS spending in the 1997-2010 period. How did you see that feeding through to the front line, particularly bearing in mind the previous problems you'd seen in the 80s and 90s?
I can give you one very simple example. In the mid-90s, we had some very old hospitals in my constituency and in my city. And there was a proposal to replace the existing hospital.
This is in Derby.
This is in Derby, which all the local MPs opposed because it just seemed completely unrealistic. We were told that we would close down one or maybe both of the existing hospitals, and we get a new hospital for £10 million. And it was absolutely obvious there were going to be all sorts of cuts in staff and all this kind of thing to find the money for it. It just didn't make any sense at all. It was very unpopular and it died the death. Then we were elected with proper funding for the health service, and we got our new hospital, which is brilliant. £300 million, and that's not because of the way the economy changed. That's because it was a properly planned, well thought through proposal, and also we have a small medical school attached to it as well. So the difference between what was clearly going to be makeshift, cheese-paring, inadequate health hospital provision to what we have now, which is doing immensely well, and there's a television program about it recently and how great the care is that is being provided there. It was a transformation of doing things properly in the health service from trying to do things on the cheap, if at all. But of course, like everywhere else, our hospital, our brilliant new hospital, is still being affected by the cuts that are taking place now.
And that issue is very much one that is present in our minds at the moment in the National Health Service in England. We're on year 8 of the austerity that was introduced by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2010. And whilst there were clearly strides forward in NHS funding between 1997 and 2010, how great do you think the challenge is now going forward?
I think the challenge is considerable because we do have to take account now of the issues of social care in a way that wasn't done in the past, and you could argue wasn't needed in the past, although there were things like convalescent homes and so on which might have eased the burden. But I don't think there's any doubt we have to look again both at at the levels of funding, at the kind of funding, but absolutely at the interaction. I'm afraid I've always been somebody who had some doubts about, some people have called for local authority running of the health service, because when, for example, I was in Lincoln, it's a different public service, but the education service in Lincolnshire was devastated by the fact that they'd never had an education chair who had been to a state school or sent their children to a state school. So the level of the council tax was more important to them than the level of the standard of the schools. And I think if you had total local authority control, there would be a risk that in some parts of the country, the care would be, where they've elected Tory councils, the care would be inadequate. But you've got to get somehow cohesive working between the local authorities and the health service as is, in order to take care of that mix of problems and deal with the individual, with the person, and not just with the rules of the organisation.
It's fascinating, actually, you raised the issue of social care, Margaret, because I've heard that described as one of the great policy challenges of the next 20
Yes.
or 30 years. Do you think that integrating those two services is perhaps the only way, realistically, that we can deal with it going forward?
It may be. I mean, I was very attracted by the proposals that we put forward when Andy Burnham was Health Secretary towards the end of the life of the government for a new national care service. And I think we do have to look very seriously at something along those lines and work out how those links and ties with local authority care can be resolved. But there isn't any doubt. The worst possible thing to do would be to have more private involvement in the health service as such and in social care. I vividly remember a case a year or so ago of a lady with considerable care needs in a rural part of the country. I can't remember exactly which county, Cambridgeshire, I think. She was trapped in hospital. She'd gone in September. She was still there in January or February, because in the area where she lives, they've privatised all the social care, and the people who provide it now, the private companies, couldn't make a profit out of providing her social care, so they just didn't. So she was stuck in hospital, her husband visiting her every day. It was tragic. It was incredibly expensive, and it was terrible for both of them. And it was because it was a private company, they didn't have to provide the care, and they didn't.
And that, I think, is a very salutary example of when you move away from the idea of free at the point of
Absolutely.
delivery. As we come now to the 70th anniversary of the National Health Service, one of the issues we face is that there are very, very few people alive now who can remember what the situation was like prior to 1948. Do you think that this 70th anniversary is an opportunity to make that case again about how important it is to have healthcare free at the point of delivery based on need, not wealth?
I would say two things to you. First, we were an ordinary family with a decent wage, but my mother told me that we still had, and just ordinary childhood ailments, that we still had unpaid bills with our GP when the health service came in, because you had to pay it off bit by bit. And we had a bit of ill luck. My eldest sister got polio when she was 14. She was in hospital for 6 months. She had a lot of very expensive treatment and care. I think if it hadn't been for the health service, we'd still be paying off for her care now. And you don't forget that.
Absolutely not. And I think that, again, demonstrates the importance of healthcare. Also, as we look at this 70th anniversary, and we consider the 70 years of history of the NHS, do you think there'll still be an NHS 70 years from now?
A lot depends on whether they elect Tory governments. You just have to look back, OK, they opposed the setting up of the National Health Service, and since then they've always claimed it's safe in their hands. But if you look at their record, whenever they go out of office, they leave the health service worse than they found it. And that's particularly true now. When we left office, the health service had the best ratings from everybody that it has ever had. And it's already going very badly away from that. And I am in no doubt at all, if we continue to elect Tory governments, the health service will be destroyed. Social care will be provided only by private companies. Healthcare will be provided only by private companies who want to make a profit. If they can't make a profit, they won't provide the service. And if you can't pay, you'll go without. And that would be a tragedy.
Also, as we think of the National Health Service, it clearly has a very significant place in our national life, in our national consciousness, if you like. And one of the real demonstrations of that in recent years has been the opening ceremony for the 2012 London Olympics, and Danny Boyle's famous ceremony that had the National Health Service as the centrepiece of it. How do you see that relationship between the National Health Service and the British people and its significance?
I think it was a Tory, actually, who said, might even have been Margaret Thatcher, who said that the NHS is the religion of the British people. And I think it is. I think it's one of the things that most underpins people's sense of belonging, of community, and of security. It's a terrible thing when serious illness hits any family. And it happens to most families at some point in their lives. That in itself is devastating. If into the bargain you're having to worry about exactly how you pay for it, what the bill will be, I think, we would be a very different country. We'd perhaps be a more selfish country. We'd certainly be a more fearful country. And I think that would be a real tragedy.
Margaret Beckett, thank you very much.